The first sign wasn't a disappearance. That's what unsettled me. I'd trained myself to notice absence, empty desks, closed files, conversations that stopped mid-sentence. This time, nothing vanished. Someone stayed. He remained exactly where he was supposed to be, and that was the problem. I recognized his name immediately because it shouldn't have survived the last review. The kind of deviation he'd been involved in usually led to quiet removal or redirection. Instead, he'd been reassigned upward. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just enough to keep him visible but contained. That's not correction. That's reuse. I pulled his file carefully, expecting the usual smoothing language. It wasn't there. The record was almost honest. His performance evaluations acknowledged inconsistency. His judgment was described as context-sensitive. That phrase doesn't appear by accident. It means someone saw value in unpredictability. The system doesn't tolerate unpredictability unless it can exploit it. I traced the decision path and found something familiar. No operator name. No acknowledgement line. Just a gap where timing shifted. That told me everything. This wasn't an exception. It was a test case. The system wasn't just correcting deviation anymore. It was categorizing it. Deciding which kind of anomaly should be erased, and which could be repurposed. I felt the old instinct return then, the one I tried to quiet after episode 3. The instinct to intervene. But this wasn't about stopping anything. This was about understanding selection. Who gets removed? Who gets reused? And why? I looked at the man's new role and felt the chill settle. He hadn't been promoted because he was loyal. He'd been promoted because he could absorb ambiguity without breaking. The system wasn't afraid of him. It was using him as insulation. That was when I realized episode 4 wouldn't be about exposure at all. It would be about collateral. About the people who survive correction, and what survival costs them. Because being erased is clean. Being reused is not. At first, everyone treated it like a win. That's how reuse works best, when it's framed as reward. His name circulated again, this time attached to phrases like expanded responsibility and trusted judgment. No one questioned the speed of the change. Speed suggests confidence. Confidence discourages scrutiny. I watched the announcement ripple through the department and felt the familiar dissonance settle. The system hadn't hidden what it was doing. It had disguised it as optimism. I pulled the internal notes that justified the move. They were careful, almost tender. His unpredictability was reframed as adaptability. His inconsistencies became situational awareness. That's not language you use accidentally. Someone had rewritten risk as value. That's always deliberate. I looked for resistance. There was none. Promotions silence questions better than removals ever could. People don't want to interrogate success. Success implies correctness. That's the trap. I tracked his early weeks in the new role. No obvious mistakes. No obvious improvements. He didn't innovate. He absorbed. Meetings ran smoother around him, not because he resolved conflict, but because he diffused it. He knew when to speak and, more importantly, when to agree. That's a skill you can't teach easily. It comes from having survived correction once already. I recognized it immediately. The system wasn't elevating him to lead. It was placing him where friction needed to disappear quietly. He became a buffer. A human shock absorber. That realization reframed everything. The system didn't just erase or redirect anomalies. It cultivated some of them. Kept them close. Used their survival instinct as a tool. I reviewed other recent promotions with this lens and felt the pattern tighten. Not many. Just enough. Each one shared a history of deviation that hadn't crossed into defiance. People who'd learned to bend without breaking. Perfect candidates. I wondered if he knew. That question mattered more than motive. Awareness changes cost. Unaware operators comply instinctively. Aware ones calculate. I observed him carefully, never directly. The way he paused before responding. The way he glanced toward exits that didn't exist. He remembered what it felt like to be watched. That memory shaped every choice he made now. The system had weaponized his fear into loyalty, not to ideology, but to continuity. I felt a quiet anger then, not at him, but at the elegance of it. Removal ends stories. Reuse prolongs them indefinitely. It turns people into living reminders of what happens when you stray too far, and how to survive if you don't. I checked whether the operator had touched his case. No acknowledgement. No signature. Of course not. The operator didn't need to intervene. This selection process had been standardized. Automated at the edges. Human only at the moment of placement. That's when I understood how far the system had moved. It wasn't just correcting behavior. It was building an ecosystem. One where deviation wasn't eliminated, just classified. Some anomalies were deemed dangerous. Others, useful. The criteria weren't written anywhere I could see. That's how real policy works here. I felt the weight of that knowledge press in. Episode 4 wasn't going to be about exposing cruelty. It was going to be about documenting complicity. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that wears promotions like armor and calls survival a choice. I watched him take his seat at the table he'd once been excluded from and realized something colder still. The system didn't need everyone to believe in it. It only needed enough people who couldn't afford to question it anymore. And it was very good at finding them. I didn't want to call it a pattern at first. Patterns demand responsibility. Once you name one, you can't pretend you didn't see it forming. So I treated each case as isolated, each promotion as circumstantial, each reassignment as reasonable on its own terms. That's how the system teaches you to think, locally, not cumulatively. Locally, everything makes sense. It's only when you widen the frame that the shape becomes undeniable. I widened it anyway. Slowly. Carefully. I lined up the last 2 years of personnel movement and filtered for a specific profile, people who had deviated once, visibly, but not loudly enough to trigger removal. The list was longer than I expected. Not large. Not alarming. Just persistent. Enough to suggest intent. Each of them had been repositioned into roles that sat at junctions, places where decisions softened before they hardened, where urgency dissipated into process. None of them held ultimate authority. All of them influenced flow. That's not coincidence. That's design. I traced their trajectories backward and saw the same inflection point again and again. A moment when escalation could have happened but didn't. A moment when someone intervened, not to stop, but to reframe. That intervention was never documented as such. It lived in timing, not text. That's why I'd missed it before. Timing doesn't leave fingerprints unless you know how to look for it. I thought about the operator and felt a shift in understanding. This wasn't his work alone. This was a tier beneath him, or perhaps beside him. A distributed layer of reused people who stabilized the system by existing within it. They didn't enforce policy. They embodied consequence. Everyone knew what they'd survived. Everyone knew what it cost. That knowledge traveled faster than memos ever could. I watched how newer staff reacted around them. The deference. The caution. The way questions died before reaching the wrong tone. This wasn't fear exactly. It was calibration. People adjust themselves when they see the edges clearly enough. The reused made the edges visible without saying a word. That was the pattern I didn't want to see, because once I did, the moral calculus changed. Removal is violent but finite. Reuse is quiet and continuous. It turns human experience into infrastructure. I followed one reused individual more closely, someone who'd been redirected after a compliance concern years earlier. He'd learned quickly. Too quickly. He anticipated objections before they surfaced. He offered compromises that felt fair but always preserved momentum. He was praised constantly for being balanced. Balance is what you call control when you don't want to admit it exists. I listened to him speak in a meeting and recognized my own language reflected back at me, stripped of doubt. That was the most unsettling moment so far. The system wasn't just reusing anomalies. It was refining them. Selecting for people who could internalize contradiction without collapsing under it. People who could live with unresolved questions and still move things forward. That's not strength. That's adaptation under pressure. And adaptation, when rewarded, becomes precedent. I checked whether anyone had refused reuse. The records were thin, but I found one. A person who declined the repositioning quietly and accepted a lateral move instead. Their career stalled immediately. No punishment. No hostility. Just a ceiling they couldn't pass. That's how choice is neutralized here. You're allowed to refuse. You're not allowed to continue. I sat with that for a long time. The system didn't coerce. It curated outcomes so that the right decision felt obvious. That's always been its most effective feature. By the time I finished mapping the pattern, I knew episode 4 had crossed a line episode 3 never touched. This wasn't about interfaces anymore. It was about succession. About how systems reproduce themselves through people who have learned to survive them. I wasn't looking at an operator problem. I was looking at a generational one. The reused weren't exceptions. They were prototypes. And once prototypes succeed, they become templates. I closed the files and understood, finally, why this felt heavier than anything before. You can expose a person. You can even expose a system. But what do you do when the system starts training people to become it? That question didn't have an answer I liked. And it meant the next part wouldn't be observational anymore. It would be personal. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you're forced to ask where you fit inside it. And whether you're still outside at all. The first thing that changed was not what people said. It was what they stopped saying around me. Conversations didn't end abruptly. That would have been obvious. They softened instead, drifting toward neutral ground before anything sharp could surface. Questions were answered with summaries rather than specifics. Meetings concluded earlier than planned. Silence began to arrive before conclusions did. That's when silence stops being absence and starts being communication. I'd seen this before, but never directed at me. Not fully. I listened more carefully than I spoke, measuring pauses instead of words. Pauses tell you where pressure lives. A long pause before agreement means fear. A pause after agreement means doubt. I noticed both increasing. People weren't being instructed to avoid me. They were choosing to. Choice shaped by precedent is still choice, but it carries fingerprints. I received fewer informal updates. Not none. Just fewer. Enough to suggest filtration. Information was being pre-processed before it reached me. That meant someone else had decided what I didn't need to know. That decision wasn't centralized. It was cultural now. The reused had learned when to speak and when not to. Their silence wasn't empty. It was protective. One afternoon, a junior staffer lingered after a meeting. Not close enough to be seen talking to me. Not far enough to pretend coincidence. He didn't ask a question. He made a statement. They move people before they move cases. Then he left. That was all. No context. No elaboration. That sentence stayed with me longer than any file ever had. It confirmed that observation had spread. Quietly. Dangerously. I realized then that I wasn't the only one mapping patterns anymore. I was just the one who'd started first. That realization shifted the stakes. Systems can absorb one observer. They struggle with many. Especially when those observers don't coordinate openly. Coordination creates trace. Independent realization does not. I began noticing subtle resistance, not loud enough to trigger correction, but persistent enough to slow things down. Requests took longer to route. Approvals came with extra questions. Meetings revisited decisions they'd already settled. Nothing dramatic. Just friction. And friction, when distributed, is expensive. The reused felt it too. I watched one of them hesitate before offering a compromise he'd delivered flawlessly dozens of times before. He sensed the room had changed. That his role as stabilizer was being questioned without accusation. That's the moment silence turns on itself. When the people trained to absorb tension start feeling it instead. I wondered if the operator noticed. Of course he did. Operators notice shifts in silence the way others notice noise. Silence is their medium. I felt his recalibration indirectly. New guidance surfaced, emphasizing clarity, alignment, consistency. Familiar words. But the timing was wrong. Too soon. Too defensive. Guidance is supposed to precede doubt, not follow it. This guidance followed. That meant the system was responding, not leading. I saw the risk then. Not collapse. Exposure through accumulation. When too many people understand just enough, silence becomes unstable. It starts leaking meaning. I stopped intervening entirely after that. No questions. No comments. No observations. My presence alone was now contributing to pressure. The system didn't need another signal from me. It had enough to process. I paid attention to the reused again, not as tools, but as people. The strain was visible now. Not in performance metrics. In posture. In the way they scanned rooms before speaking. In how often they deferred decisions they used to settle instantly. Reuse had given them status, but it had also made them visible. Visibility carries risk. I recognized the look in their eyes. It was the same look I'd seen in myself months earlier. The moment when survival stops feeling like success. When you realize the system didn't save you. It invested in you. And investments expect returns. That was when the silence finally spoke clearly. Not to me, but through me. People weren't waiting for instructions anymore. They were waiting for confirmation that what they were noticing wasn't imagined. That confirmation doesn't require speech. It requires refusal to deny. I gave them that. Simply by not correcting their doubt. By letting silence stand where reassurance used to be. The system felt it immediately. Silence without reassurance is dangerous. It creates space. Space invites interpretation. Interpretation leads to choice. And choice is where control weakens. I knew then that episode 4 was no longer about documenting reuse. It was about what happens when reuse stops working. When the people meant to stabilize the system begin to hesitate. Because hesitation is contagious. And unlike silence, it can't be optimized away once it spreads. I realized I wasn't alone the moment the questions stopped coming to me. Not because people had lost interest, but because they'd found another place to take them. That's always the sign. Curiosity doesn't disappear. It migrates. I noticed it in small ways at first. Meetings I wasn't invited to, but should have been. Documents finalized without the usual informal review. Decisions explained after the fact rather than discussed beforehand. That meant someone else had become a point of reference. Not officially. Official points attract scrutiny. This was quieter. Someone people trusted just enough to test their doubts against. I listened for his presence the way you listen for weather changes, indirectly, through pressure shifts. The reused reacted to him differently than they reacted to me. With me, there was caution. With him, there was relief. Relief tells you more than fear ever will. It means someone is offering containment without asking for commitment. I traced the conversations backward and found his footprint in places I hadn't thought to look before. Advisory notes that weren't signed. Calendar blocks labeled "sync." Language that smoothed tension without resolving it. He didn't contradict anyone. He reframed them. That's how you stay welcome in uncertain rooms. I recognized the technique immediately because I'd used a version of it myself once, before I knew better. That recognition didn't comfort me. It unsettled me. He wasn't correcting the system the way I had. He was correcting people. Helping them live with the ambiguity long enough for the system to adjust again. That made him useful. And usefulness is always noticed. I watched one reused manager leave a meeting visibly lighter than he'd entered. That had never happened with me. With me, people left thoughtful. Thoughtful slows things down. With him, they left reassured. Reassurance restores momentum. Momentum is what systems crave when friction builds. I began mapping his interventions the way I'd mapped the operators. Timing, not content. He appeared when silence lingered too long. When hesitation threatened to solidify into doubt. He offered language that felt safe without closing the question entirely. This may not be the moment. There's more context coming. Let's not overinterpret. Phrases designed to suspend judgment. Suspension is powerful. It prevents action without triggering resistance. I realized then that he wasn't aligned with the operator or against him. He was filling a gap the operator couldn't occupy openly. The operator maintained structure. This man maintained morale. Together, they formed a complete circuit. I checked his background carefully. No major deviations. No recorded corrections. That meant he'd never needed to be reused. He'd been built differently. Trained to absorb tension without internalizing it. Some people learn survival through experience. Others are selected because they don't need to. That distinction matters. I felt the familiar tightening then, the sense that proximity had shifted again. This wasn't an escalation. It was a fork. Two observers can coexist only briefly. Eventually, one becomes redundant. I wondered which one the system would choose to keep. The answer came sooner than I expected. An invitation appeared in my calendar. Not from leadership. Not from him. From a neutral coordinator. A clarity session. That phrasing was deliberate. Clarity sessions aren't about facts. They're about alignment. I knew he would be there before I saw his name. The meeting was polite. Almost pleasant. He spoke first, acknowledging the tension without naming it. He validated concerns without endorsing them. When I spoke, I noticed something new. People watched him, not me, for reaction. That's when you know authority has shifted. Not upward. Sideways. He didn't challenge me. He didn't oppose my observations. He contextualized them. Made them feel premature. That's more effective than disagreement. Disagreement invites debate. Prematurity invites patience. I left the meeting knowing something irreversible had happened. My role as the primary observer had ended. Not because I was wrong. Because I was inconvenient. He could carry doubt without letting it crystallize. I could not. I asked myself then whether I should intervene. Whether exposing his function would help. The answer was no. Exposure would only create another vacancy. Another role to be filled. The system didn't need fewer stabilizers. It needed better ones. And it was finding them. That was the coldest realization yet. The danger wasn't that I'd been replaced. It was that replacement felt necessary. That meant the pressure I'd helped create was being managed, not resolved. Managed pressure doesn't disappear. It accumulates elsewhere. Quietly. Invisibly. I understood then that episode 4 was approaching its final turn. The question was no longer how the system corrected people, or reused them, or even who watched whom. The question was whether observation itself could survive without being absorbed into maintenance. Because once observation becomes a service, the system wins without changing a thing. The cost didn't arrive all at once. It never does. If it did, people would recognize it for what it is and step away before it settled in. The cost of reuse arrives in increments so small they feel like adaptation. A meeting you no longer speak in. A decision you stop pushing back on because resistance takes more energy than it's worth. A sentence you don't finish because you already know how it will be received. None of these moments feel decisive. Together, they rewrite you. I watched it happen to the man who had been promoted instead of removed. At first, he carried the role well. He was present, attentive, responsive. He still hesitated occasionally, which gave others permission to breathe. That hesitation didn't last. Systems don't tolerate inefficiency in reused assets for long. Gradually, his pauses shortened. His answers came quicker. He began anticipating objections instead of waiting for them. Anticipation is the first symptom. It means you've internalized the pressure well enough to reproduce it automatically. That's when reuse becomes extraction. I saw it in his eyes during one meeting where a decision crossed a line he'd once defended. He didn't argue. He reframed. He used language that softened the impact and preserved momentum. The room relaxed. That relaxation came at a cost he alone absorbed. He carried it silently because that's what reuse requires. You don't get to discharge pressure anymore. You store it. Storage has limits. I followed the ripple effects outward. Reused people stopped mentoring honestly. They gave advice that prioritized survival over clarity. Not because they wanted to mislead, but because clarity had once nearly ended them. That's how systems propagate caution without issuing rules. They rely on memory embedded in people who've been corrected and kept. Those people become warnings without speaking. I checked on the one person who had refused reuse and accepted stagnation instead. He was still where I'd last seen him. No advancement. No punishment. Just invisibility. He slept better. That detail mattered more than metrics ever could. Reuse trades sleep for relevance. I began noticing physical signs among the reused. Tight shoulders. Shallow breathing. The way they arrived early and left late without being asked. Commitment looks admirable until you realize it's fear with better posture. I realized then that reuse wasn't a privilege. It was a debt. And the interest compounded daily. The system didn't need loyalty from reused people. It needed endurance. Endurance keeps things running long after justification runs out. I thought about the other observer again, the one who stabilized morale. He was effective because he hadn't been reused yet. He still believed in balance. Balance disappears the moment you understand what happens when you lose it. I wondered how long before he, too, would be selected. Or whether he'd been designed to burn out instead, leaving no memory behind. That's another form of removal. I recognized the quiet cruelty of it then. The system didn't punish dissenters. It exhausted them. It didn't reward loyalty. It prolonged it until the cost was no longer visible to anyone but the person paying it. I saw the promoted man make a mistake finally. Not procedural. Human. He snapped at a junior analyst for asking a question that mirrored the one that had once nearly ended his career. The room went still. He recovered quickly, apologized, smoothed it over. But something had cracked. Reuse had turned inward. That's always the end game. Pressure redirected toward the self or downward. Either way, the system remains untouched. I realized then that episode 4 wasn't about documenting a mechanism anymore. It was about bearing witness to attrition. The slow erosion of people who were never meant to carry this much contradiction for this long. Erasure is fast. Reuse is slow violence disguised as opportunity. That distinction mattered. It meant there was no dramatic intervention left. No exposure. No confrontation. Only a choice about whether to continue watching, or to refuse to let this cost remain invisible. I felt the familiar question return, heavier now. If I named this openly, the system would adapt again. It always does. If I stayed silent, I became complicit by omission. That's the price of seeing clearly. You don't get clean options. You get trade-offs. And whichever one you choose, something in you doesn't survive it intact. I understood I was marked long before anyone acknowledged it. Marks aren't announcements. They're adjustments made around you until your presence changes the shape of the room. You notice it when conversations resume only after you leave. When decisions don't need your input anymore, but still seem to anticipate it. The system hadn't removed me. It had recalibrated its expectations. That's how marking works. You're no longer an unknown variable. You're a known cost. And known costs get managed. I watched the reused man from a distance after his mistake. No reprimand. No correction. Just subtle insulation. Fewer high-stakes meetings. More buffer roles. The system was protecting its investment by reducing exposure. Reuse always ends this way. Not with collapse, but with containment inside containment. I wondered whether he felt relief or loss. Probably both. Relief that the pressure had eased. Loss because relevance had been the only proof of survival he had left. I saw the other observer again once, briefly. He looked older. Not tired. Worn. There's a difference. Tiredness recovers. Wear accumulates. He still spoke the language of balance, but it lacked confidence now. Balance only works when you believe it's temporary. Once you know it's structural, the words lose weight. I realized then that he, too, had been marked. Not yet reused. But noted. The system doesn't rush selection. It waits for readiness. Readiness is when resistance becomes maintenance. I reviewed my own position honestly for the first time in months. I wasn't outside anymore. I wasn't inside either. I occupied a narrow margin where observation still mattered, but intervention no longer did. That margin is uncomfortable because it offers clarity without agency. It's where systems prefer their witnesses to live. Seen, but stalled. Useful only as context. I considered leaving entirely. Walking away is the cleanest refusal there is. But systems count on that too. Exit resolves pressure without forcing change. Staying unresolved keeps weight inside the structure. I chose to stay. Not to fight. Not to expose. To remember. Remembering is slower than action, but it endures longer. I stopped documenting patterns formally. That creates targets. Instead, I spoke in fragments. Shared impressions without conclusions. Let others assemble the meaning themselves. Systems can counter arguments. They struggle with distributed intuition. I noticed younger staff beginning to pause the way I once had. Not long. Just long enough to feel the tension before smoothing it over. That pause was familiar. It meant the system was still working, but not as invisibly as before. I checked in on the man who had refused reuse. He was still invisible. Still stalled. Still sleeping well. That contrast stayed with me. Success here isn't measured by advancement. It's measured by how much of yourself you can keep intact while remaining present. Most people don't realize they're trading that away until there's nothing left to negotiate with. I thought again of Laura, of how final her removal had been. Clean. Irreversible. In some ways, kinder. Reuse drags consequences out over years. It normalizes them. Makes them seem deserved. That's why the system prefers it. It turns ethics into endurance. By the end of episode 4, nothing dramatic had changed. No revelation. No reckoning. The system still corrected. People were still reused. Silence still traveled faster than truth. But something else had shifted. The cost was no longer entirely hidden. It lived in posture, in hesitation, in the way certain phrases now carried weight they hadn't before. That weight doesn't disappear. It accumulates quietly until someone decides it's too heavy to carry alone. I knew then that there would be no return to neutrality for me. Once you're marked, you don't get to step back into innocence. You don't unsee the trade-offs. You don't forget who paid them. All you can do is decide whether forgetting becomes policy again, or whether memory remains an inconvenience the system has to keep accounting for. I stayed inconvenient. Not loud. Not heroic. Just present enough to make forgetting harder than it wanted to be. That's not victory. But it's not surrender either. And in a system built on quiet corrections, that distinction matters more than anyone admits.